In this video, I'm planning on showing you how to name covalent compounds. So covalent compounds are named following different rules than ionic compounds. And the reason why is because covalent compounds can form more than one compound from the same two elements. So for instance, if we have carbon and oxygen, we can form CO or we can form CO2. So the naming conventions are different for covalent compounds than they are for ionic compounds. And so the first thing you want to do is figure out, okay, well, do I have an ionic or a covalent compound? So remember that for a covalent compound, if you have a nonmetal and a nonmetal, you have a covalent compound. And remember, if you have a metal and a nonmetal, you have an ionic compound. So when naming your compounds, the first thing you always need to do is figure out, okay, do I have an ionic or a covalent compound? If you have an ionic compound, go back to the video I made on naming ionic compounds to name that. And if you have a covalent compound, I'm going to show you how you name that compound in this video. So there's a few steps that we follow to name covalent compounds. And I'm going to go through the steps and then I'm going to do some examples with these covalent compounds. So the first thing you do is write down the name of the first element that's in your compound. The next step is to write down the first syllable of the second name followed by "ide." So for instance, if you have oxygen, it would be oxide. So it would be the first syllable followed by "ide." And then the next thing you do is add prefixes for the number of atoms. And the prefixes you're going to be using are these. So mono for 1, di for 2, tri for 3, tetra for 4, penta for 5, hexa for 6, hepta for 7, octa for 8, nona for 9, and deca for 10. And then there's a couple other rules, and I'll point these out as we go through these examples, but a couple other things are, first of all, if you only have one of your first element, you don't actually put mono on the first element. And then if we run into a case of where we have this AO or OO, that becomes an O. So an example of where that would happen is, let's say that you have 7 oxygens, so you would have hep, ta, and then the oxygen is oxide, so this would be if oxygen were your second element. So you would combine this AO from the hepta and the oxide to just O, so that would be hept oxide. But I'll point that out when we run into this with some of these examples. So let's go through these. I'm going to start with this one, the silicone and nitrogen. So we have this, so I'll just put this here, so S3N2. So we have this compound and we want to name it. First thing we want to do is figure out, okay, is this an ionic or is it a covalent compound? Well, we have a nonmetal and we have a nonmetal, so we have a covalent compound. So we know we're going to be using the naming rules for covalent compounds. So we just go to our steps. The first thing we do is write down the name of the first element. So that is sulfur. And I'm actually going to move this over a little bit. So I'm going to write sulfur here. And then we write down the name of our second element with the first syllable plus "ide." For the second one, we have nitrogen. So this would be nitride. Now what we need to do is add our prefixes. So what we do is go to the prefix table, and we have a 3 on the sulfur, so we have 3 sulfurs. The prefix for 3 is tri, so we just add a tri to the sulfur, so we have trisulfur. And then on the nitrogen, we have 2 nitrogens. We go to our prefix table. The 2 is di, so we add di to the second element. So we have trisulfur dinitride. Okay, let's do this one now. So for this one, we have silicone and we have bromine. So I'm going to write that SiBr4. So what we do is, first of all, we need to figure out, okay, is this, so we want to name this, and so we need to figure out, is this an ionic compound or is it a covalent compound? So silicone is a nonmetal and bromine is a nonmetal. So we have 2 nonmetals. So we determine that this is a covalent compound. And so now what we need to do is name it. So we just go to our steps. The first element is silicone. So we write down the name. So write down the name of your first element. So we have silicone. And then our next step, write down the first syllable of the second element plus "ide." We have bromine, so that would be bromide. So we write down bromide. And now what we need to do is look at we need to figure out which prefixes we're adding. So for the silicone, we only have 1 silicone. So if we went to our prefix table, that would be mono. But then we have this rule that we don't put mono if we just have 1 of the first element, we don't put mono. So we're not going to put anything on the silicone. And then on the bromide, we have 4 bromines. So if we go to our table, 4 is tetra. So this is silicone, and then we put tetra bromide. So this is the name of this molecule, silicone tetrabromide. So we've done this one and this one. Let's do this one now. So for this molecule or compound, we have B2O3. So what we need to do, we need to figure out, okay, is this ionic or a covalent bond? So we want to name this. So boron is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal. So we have 2 nonmetals. So we know that we have a covalent bond. So we're going to use the covalent bonding rules. And so the first step is to write down the first element name. So for this one, the first element's name is boron. And then the next step is to write down the first syllable of the second element plus "ide." We have oxygen, so this is going to be ox-ide. Okay, so we've done the first 2 steps. Now the next step is to add the prefix for the number of atoms. So going back to boron, we have 2 borons. So if we go look at our prefix list, 2 is di. So we put a di here. So we have diboron. And then looking at oxygen, we have 3 oxygens. So if we go look at our prefix list, 3 is tri. So we put tri here. So this molecule is diboron trioxide. Okay, now let's look at CO and CO2. So I'm going to put actually I think I'm going to erase these ones that we've done, and then I'll do CO and CO2. Do CO. To name this, well, first of all, let's say we're just given this CO and we're told to name it. Well, the first thing we need to do is figure out, okay, do we have an ionic bond or a covalent bond? Well, carbon is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal. So we have 2 nonmetals. So we know that we have a covalent bond. So then what we need to, then we want to follow the rules for naming covalent compounds. So we just go to our first step. The first step is to write down the name of the first element. The first element is carbon, so I'm going to write that down. And then the next step is to write down the second element with the first syllable plus "ide." We have oxygen, so this is going to be oxide. So now what we need to do is add our prefixes for the number of atoms. For the first atom in this molecule, we have a carbon. And so that would be, we have one carbon, so that one is mono. But then we have this rule here that we don't put mono on the first element. So we're not going to put anything on the carbon because we just have one. And then if we go to the second atom, we have one oxygen. So going back to our prefixes, one is mono. So that means that we're going to put a mono on this. I'm going to actually rewrite this. So this is mono oxide. Okay, so now we have this case where we have two O's next to each other when we wrote the prefix on this atom's name. So the rules for this is if we have a AO or if we have OO, that becomes an O. So in this case, this would be carbon, and this OO are going to become an O. So this is going to be carbon monoxide. Now let's do CO2. So for this one, we already, let's just go through. So we've already figured out that carbon and oxygen are nonmetals. Since we have two nonmetals, we know that this is a covalent bond. So we're going to use the covalent bonding name rules. So what we do is, going back up to these steps, we have our first element name, which is carbon. And then we have the first syllable of the second element name with "ide" attached to it. We have oxygen again, so this is going to be oxide. Now we need to figure out our prefixes. So we have one carbon, so that would be on the prefix list, that would be mono, but we don't put mono on the first element if we only have one. And then going to oxygen, we have two oxygens. If we look at our prefix list, 2 is di. So this would be carbon dioxide. Remember, if you're naming a compound, the very first thing you want to do is figure out if you have an ionic compound or a covalent compound. If you have an ionic compound, I have a video on naming ionic compounds, so go watch that video and use the rules in that video for naming your compound. If you have a covalent compound, you would use these rules. So I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.